Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. We have some breaking news. Earlier today, it was announced that Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 is official for UFC 282 December 10th in Las Vegas. And there's so many different layers to peel back regarding this announcement. And I think there is two key words that were missing from this announcement that I think could lead to some of the biggest MMA news in all of 2022. And I feel like not enough people are talking about it. So we're going to talk about that in this video. I'm going to give my reaction to this fight being announced. Does Glover Teixeira deserve a rematch? And I'm also going to talk about how I think the UFC is making a mistake with this booking. And I'm also going to give you guys an early prediction for this fight. So first off, I feel like an elaborate series of events had to happen here for Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 to come together. Because you look at the first fight at UFC 275 earlier this year, May of this year, this was one of the greatest light heavyweight fights of all time. And I believe it's one of the greatest UFC fights of all time in general. This was an amazing fight with multiple momentum swings. Both guys were close to getting finished multiple times throughout this fight. And then you have a buzzer beater finish in the 5th round. And I know buzzer beater is a little bit of an exaggeration, but it was in the last 45 seconds. Jiri Prochazka snatches up a rear naked choke on Glover Teixeira. Who would have ever predicted that for the outcome of the UFC 275 main event? I mean, an incredible fight. And I think it's a fight that will be remembered. It will go down in the history books. And I think it had a lot of people saying, you know what, we would love to see this rematch. Because if you go to the scorecards, if Glover Teixeira does not get finished at the end of that 5th round, and you go to the scorecards, most likely Glover Teixeira gets the win. And the 5th round was arguably his best round, which is crazy. He almost stopped Jiri multiple times in the 5th round. And then you have the fact that Glover Teixeira had him full mounted with less than a minute to go, and somehow Jiri Prochazka fights out of it, and not only fights out of it, ends up getting the rear naked choke. And then you have a couple more circumstances that I want to point out. One of them being Jan Blachowicz versus Alexander Rakic. Because I believe maybe if Rakic won, he would be next in line to fight Jiri Prochazka. Well, what happened in that fight? Kind of a fluke injury to Alexander Rakic. I know Jan Blachowicz landed some good kicks, but you know, it wasn't a definitive win. It wasn't a decisive win. It wasn't an impressive win, even though he did win. So now it's like, well, Jan Blachowicz won. He's the former champion who lost to Glover Teixeira. And now he won a fight, but it wasn't super impressive, and it was kind of controversial ending. And then you look at, well, who else could be next for the light heavyweight division for the #1 contender spot? And you look at Magomed Ankalaev. Well, he fought Anthony Smith, and even though he was winning this fight, again, another injury. Anthony Smith injures his leg. And so we kind of get an ending that leaves people unsatisfied. It's not like you saw Magomed Ankalaev go out there, starch Anthony Smith, and then everybody's clamoring for Magomed Ankalaev to get a title shot. So now you have the next two contenders with not the biggest wins and kind of controversial endings. And Jan Blachowicz just got finished by Glover Teixeira back at UFC 267, and it was very decisive. So the UFC was kind of in this weird spot. Who really deserves the next title shot? Because honestly, you could have picked a name out of the hat as far as Glover Teixeira, Jan Blachowicz, or Magomed Ankalaev, and I would have been fine with any of those bookings because, you know, there wasn't one guy that clearly deserved it. And you have Glover Teixeira, who he had one of the greatest fights of all time against Jiri Prochazka, but he got finished in the 5th round. Regardless, he got finished. He never defended his belt. He got dominated against Jan Blachowicz. So you can make the argument he doesn't deserve the rematch. And, you know, the UFC decided to go with this for UFC 282. And now we get to see this fight ran back. And, I'm excited for this fight. Don't get me wrong. But there's no way Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 is going to live up to the hype. You know, because that first fight, there's no way you match that. There's no way this fight is as good as the fight on UFC 275, the main event. There's absolutely no way. You just can't top what we saw in the main event of 275. And, you know, Glover Teixeira is getting up there in age. He's already talked about retirement in the past. He's in his 40s. And I think the UFC is kind of making a mistake here because as much as I love Glover Teixeira, And, I was so happy to see him get the win at UFC 267 over Jan Blachowicz. Now we're in a position where if he goes out there and he finishes Jiri Prochazka, I almost said Jan Blachowicz there, he may retire with the belt. And even if he doesn't retire with the belt, now we got the division a little bit logjam, because what are they going to do, a trilogy now? Jiri gave Glover the rematch after finishing him. So if Glover goes out there and let's say he finishes Jiri, most likely Glover's going to have to give him the trilogy fight. So we have two potential bad outcomes, and there's no way the fight's going to be anywhere near as good. I find that hard to believe. You cannot convince me that the fight is going to live up to what happened at UFC 275. And then the division's kind of ruined. If Glover Teixeira retires with the belt, I love Glover Teixeira. I would love to see a happy ending for him. But you look at the division, and now you have a division that's been loomed over by Jon Jones forever. And we're finally starting to get out from underneath the shadow of Jon Jones. And now Glover wins the belt back and then retires. That would be super unfortunate, even though I would be so happy for Glover Teixeira. As far as an early prediction for this fight, I picked Jiri Prochazka in the first fight. I did not pick him by 5th round submission. I think I picked him by 1st or 2nd round TKO. I can't remember. And for this second fight, I am going to go Jiri Prochazka via TKO as well. I'll be doing a full breakdown and prediction when we get closer to UFC 282 in December. But I have to go with Jiri. I picked him in the first fight. I thought his striking and his power was going to be too much for Glover. And I thought his wrestling was better than people gave him credit for. And even though he was out-wrestled in some positions, he showed great scrambles. And I believe if Jiri Prochazka dials it back just a little bit, and just stops being so crazy and so wild, I think he can put on a world-class performance against Glover Teixeira. I think he can defend the takedowns. I think he can land on the feet. I think if he does get taken down, he can work his way back to his feet. And I think Glover Teixeira is going to be, 6 months older, coming off a war. And I know Jiri Prochazka is coming off a war as well, but he's much younger. And I just think, time waits for no one. And we perpetually see in this sport the young eating the old. And I just feel like even though I think Glover Teixeira does have a legitimate chance to win this fight, I think Jiri Prochazka is going to come in. He's going to make adjustments from that first fight. And I think he's going to be a little bit more cautious. And I think he's going to go out there and finish Glover Teixeira. Another thing I wanted to talk about is I'm kind of disappointed this is the main event of not the main event of UFC 282. We're going to talk about that in a second. I'm kind of disappointed this is on UFC 282. Because I thought once the UFC announced UFC 283 in January in Brazil, I thought for sure they were going to put Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira in Brazil, considering Glover Teixeira is from Brazil. But I guess maybe they decided against that, or that was never the plans, because this fight's been rumored for a couple months, and the UFC has refused to announce it until now. They've confirmed it. So I was hoping that we were going to get Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington as the main event of UFC 282, and now it seems like that's unlikely. But the two words that were left out of this announcement, of this news, is it was not confirmed that Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira is the main event. I started talking about it for a second there, but it's not confirmed that it's the main event. So that starts having you wonder, wait a second, if Jiri Prochazka, Glover Teixeira 2 for the light heavyweight title is not the main event, what could it possibly be? And there's not a lot of options. And I could only come up with 3 potential fights that could headline UFC 282 over top of Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2. And one of those options would be Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. And this has been rumored to be happening since August for a potential interim heavyweight title, because UFC is dealing with the Francis Ngannou contract situation, and they're dealing with, he's got the knee injury. He said he's not going to return till early 2023. But I don't think this fight makes sense. If Francis Ngannou is going to be able to fight in early 2023, why would they make an interim heavyweight title fight in December? It really doesn't make a lot of sense, but it could make sense, because if the UFC and Ngannou have come to a stall with contract negotiations, and the UFC doesn't think that they'll be able to come to terms with Francis Ngannou, there is a chance, and this is why I said some of the biggest MMA news we may see in all of 2022, there is a chance we could see Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic not for the interim heavyweight title, but for the undisputed heavyweight title. It would not shock me if the UFC announces we've stripped Francis Ngannou, we're taking the belt away from him, and we are crowning a new undisputed heavyweight champion, Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic, headlining UFC 282. Now, I hope that doesn't happen, but if they make it for an interim belt, then what? Francis Ngannou is going to have to wait till the summer of next year to defend his belt or for a title unification bout? It really doesn't add up to me. The other fight that it could be would be Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. Because originally when Francis Ngannou had surgery, there was talk that he'd be ready around January of 2023. December of 2022 is only a month before that. So there is a legitimate chance we could get Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. And that's one of the only fights I could see headlining over top of Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2. And that would be straight up insanity. That's one of the biggest fights the UFC can make. And I think it would be one of the biggest selling pay-per-views we would see, the entire of 2022. I think Jon Jones, Francis Ngannou would be the top selling pay-per-view. And that's an amazing fight, but I just find it hard to believe that the UFC resolved all those contract negotiations and then Francis Ngannou's healthier sooner than usual. I just feel like there's too many, stipulations or circumstances that need to fall into place for that to potentially happen. So I don't think that's going to happen. The other option I came up with would be Conor McGregor versus someone. I don't know who that someone would be, but they always say you can put Conor McGregor versus a broomstick as the headliner for a pay-per-view, and it's still going to sell massively. So, I wonder, I don't know. There was talk of Conor returning late in 2022, earlier this year, but those talks have kind of disappeared over the past few months, and Conor hasn't been tested by USADA, and there's speculation that maybe he's retired. But maybe, just maybe, we're in October. Maybe in the next few weeks, they could announce the return of Conor McGregor versus, who knows, could be Tony Ferguson. Ew, I don't want to see that. Could be the Nate Diaz trilogy. Maybe they work something out with Nate. He gets a one-fight deal. He gets to fight Conor in the trilogy. But if Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira is not going to be the main event, it has to be a big fight. There's not a lot of fights that the UFC would put as a headliner over top of Teixeira versus Prochazka 2. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Is there any potential fights that I'm not thinking of that could headline over top of this light heavyweight title fight? Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.